So imagine you're sitting there just staring at a blank piece of paper.
Oh, the absolute worst feeling.
Right. Your brain is completely freezing up, your palms are sweating, and you're like desperately trying to remember the past tense of some highly specific verb in a language you barely even speak.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Exactly. And historically speaking, language teachers would basically just look at that struggling student, wait for them to finally write a single sentence, and then enthusiastically grab a red pen to just destroy their grammar.
Oh, yeah, the dreaded red pen. It was a very mechanical view of language.
Right, like the actual ideas the student was trying to communicate were completely secondary, which today we know is entirely backwards.
Completely backwards. I mean, writing was basically treated as a punishment,
Yeah.
or at best, a sterile laboratory for testing verb conjugations. You learned a rule, and you wrote 10 disjointed sentences just to prove you memorized it.
Yeah.
But if that same student walked out into the real world and tried to, like, write a polite email to a colleague or a persuasive letter to a landlord, they would completely fall apart.
Because they had never actually been taught how to communicate.
Exactly. They just knew the rules.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. If you are listening to this right now, you are most likely gearing up for your foreign language teaching exam.
Which is a huge undertaking.
It really is. And if you are staring down topic 6, which is written communication in the foreign language classroom, our goal today is to give you the ultimate mental blueprint.
Yeah, we want to make sure you have everything you need.
So we are looking at a stack of sources today. It includes a comprehensive academic breakdown of modern writing pedagogy, alongside this highly condensed memorization outline designed specifically for your exam, including an ultra-short memory version.
Which is going to be your best friend, honestly.
Oh, absolutely. And we're going to structure this conversation exactly how you need to write it in your exam. We're starting with the introduction and the theoretical framework, moving into the key models, and then finishing up with classroom applications and conclusions.
Right, because we want to synthesize all of this so that when you sit down in that exam hall, you aren't just regurgitating a list of, disjointed vocabulary words.
Right.
You really need to demonstrate to the examiner that you understand the underlying cognitive mechanisms of how a student learns to write. And, maybe more importantly, how you translate that theory into a chaotic room full of 30 teenagers.
Which is the real challenge, right? It's like building a house. Before we can paint the walls with all those fun classroom activities, we need to pour the concrete foundation of theory.
I love that analogy. Yes,
Yeah.
the theory is the concrete.
So let's start where your essay should start. The paradigm shift. If writing is no longer just a grammar test, what actually is it?
Well, the sources point heavily to this concept called communicative competence.
Okay, yes. And if I'm sitting down to write this exam, I am making absolutely sure the name Del Himes is in my very first paragraph.
Oh, 100%. You really can't talk about modern language teaching without him.
Right.
Himes is foundational because he was the one who finally called out that sterile, grammar-only approach. He argued that you could theoretically memorize the entire dictionary, right, and achieve perfect grammatical accuracy.
Which would be impressive.
Sure, but if you don't know how to use that language appropriately in a specific social context, you are not proficient.
That makes total sense. Like if you write this beautifully structured, highly formal academic thesis statement, but you send it as a text message to a close friend asking if they want to grab coffee, you've completely failed at communication.
Exactly. Communicative competence is all about context, audience, and purpose. It's not just the words, it's how you use them.
And this shift isn't just like some abstract theory debated in faculty lounges. It's hardwired into the rule book now.
It is.
The Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, the CEFR, which, by the way, is your holy grail for this exam, it explicitly demands that written production and written interaction are treated as core components of proficiency.
Right, it's non-negotiable now.
But to teach writing effectively, we have to understand how fundamentally weird it is compared to speaking. I love the analogy in our notes about how spoken language is like a live jam session.
Yes. The live jam session is such a perfect way to visualize spoken interaction. Because when you're speaking, it's totally spontaneous. You use the wrong word or your grammar slips a bit, the energy of the room carries you.
Yeah, you have visual cues.
Exactly. Your hand gestures, your facial expressions, the immediate feedback from the listener, all of that carries you through. You can just pivot in real time.
But written language, if spoken language is like a live jam session where you can rely on the vibe, is written language more like a meticulously produced studio album?
That is exactly it. Yes, because you don't have that live audience there to give you a confused look if something doesn't make sense.
Right.
The text is totally isolated. It has to stand completely on its own. And because of that isolation, the sources highlight 4 specific characteristics that define the nature of written communication.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first one?
First is permanence. The words don't just vanish into the air. They sit on the page, available for endless scrutiny. A reader might look at your text tomorrow, or in 10 years, completely removed from the original context.
Wow, yeah. Which means the writer carries a much heavier cognitive load, to be precise. You can't just rely on the reader, getting the gist.
Exactly. And that leads directly to the second characteristic, which is planning. Because the text is permanent, writers generally have the luxury of time.
They aren't reacting in milliseconds like they are in a conversation.
Right. They have time to organize their ideas, select information, and revise.
Okay, so permanence and planning. And the sources also point to structure and formality as the final 2 characteristics.
Yep, those are crucial.
Because writing follows recognizable genres, right? Like an angry complaint letter to a hotel looks structurally very different than a romantic poem.
Hopefully.
Right, hopefully. And generally, writing requires a higher degree of formality, meaning you need more complex syntax and a wider vocabulary range than everyday speech.
So to pull off that studio album, to manage the permanence and the structure we just talked about, a writer actually has to juggle 4 distinct cognitive and linguistic components simultaneously.
Okay, and if you are outlining your exam essay right now, you need to clearly separate these 4 components.
Yes, definitely make these clear.
So the first 2 seem fairly obvious to me. Grammatical competence and lexical competence. You need the structural roles, like the verb tenses and the syntax, and you need the vocabulary to express nuanced meaning.
Right, the basic building blocks.
But the third one, discourse competence, that feels like the silent killer for language learners.
Oh, it really is.
I mean, I've seen students who can write a sentence that is grammatically flawless, and then the next sentence is also grammatically flawless. But you put them together and the paragraph reads like a disjointed ransom note.
A ransom note. That is the perfect illustration of a failure in discourse competence.
It's so jarring to read.
It is. Discourse competence is the ability to organize ideas coherently across a whole text. It's the mastery of cohesive devices and connectors.
Give us an example of how that goes wrong.
Okay, imagine a student writes, "The hotel was incredibly noisy. Furthermore, I slept terribly."
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. The grammar in both sentences is totally fine. But using furthermore instead of as a result, or therefore, completely destroys the logical cause and effect relationship the student is trying to build.
So they lose the reader not because they conjugated a verb wrong, but because they didn't provide the right signposts.
Exactly. And managing all of those signposts, along with the grammar and the vocabulary, brings us to the 4th component, cognitive skills.
The heavy lifting.
The actual mental heavy lifting, yeah. The brain is working overtime here. It has to plan the message, retrieve the vocabulary, structure the discourse, and evaluate if the message is actually working all at the same time.
Which brings us to a massive logistical problem for the teacher. If the brain is doing all this heavy lifting, how does a student actually get from a blank page to a finished essay?
It's a huge challenge.
Because in the old days, the teacher only saw the final product. You handed in your paper, you got a C- because of those missing cohesive devices, and that was the end of the transaction.
Yep, transaction over.
But if you were writing this exam, you have to bring in Linda Flower and John R. Hayes. You have to drop those names because their model completely blew up that final product mentality.
It really did. Before Flower and Hayes, education essentially treated writing like a factory assembly line.
Very industrial.
Right. Step 1, think of an idea. Step 2, write the idea. Step 3, check for spelling. It was entirely linear.
But that's not how anyone actually writes.
It's not at all. Flower and Hayes revolutionized language pedagogy by proving that writing is actually a highly recursive process.
Okay, let's unpack this. Recursive meaning it loops back on itself constantly. It's messy.
It's extremely messy. They identified 3 dynamic stages: planning, drafting, and revising.
Okay.
So in the planning stage, you're generating ideas and analyzing your audience. In drafting, you're trying to translate those abstract ideas into concrete text. And in revising, you're evaluating the organization and the language.
But you don't just do step 1, then step 2, then step 3.
No, exactly. A student might draft half a paragraph, realize their core argument is completely weak.
Oh, I do that all the time.
Right. And then they jump all the way back to the planning stage. They cross out everything they just wrote, draft a new opening sentence, jump to revising to fix a grammar mistake, and then go back to drafting.
It's an engine with parts constantly moving backward and forward.
What's fascinating here is that acknowledging that messiness changes everything for the teacher. Well, you no longer sit at the finish line, waiting to judge the final draft with a red pen. You step into the process. You intervene when the student is stuck in the planning loop, or you teach them specific strategies for how to evaluate their own drafting.
That makes a lot of sense. But I can hear an examiner asking, though, if writing is this messy, isolated cognitive struggle, where does the CEFR's focus on communication actually come in?
That's a great question.
Because we mentioned earlier that modern writing isn't just a solitary genius locked in a cabin. The sources emphasize the written interaction model.
Yeah, the CEFR heavily emphasizes written interaction because that reflects the reality of modern life.
Yeah.
I mean, we are constantly responding to emails, engaging in online forums, collaborating on shared digital documents.
It's all interactive now.
Exactly. Written interaction requires all the recursive loops of Flower and Hayes, but with an added layer of complexity. You have to adapt your language to the reader in real time, anticipating their responses and adjusting your tone.
Okay, so if Flower and Hayes have proven that writing is this messy, back-and-forth cognitive struggle, and the CEFR demands that we teach it as an interactive, communicative skill, doesn't that make it much harder to teach? I mean, how on earth is a teacher supposed to manage 30 students all struggling at different stages of this loop at the same time?
It does sound overwhelming.
Right.
That requires a complete shift in classroom pedagogy.
Which brings us to the implications for teaching section of your essay.
Yes, it requires the communicative approach, which is really the overarching umbrella for all modern language teaching. The instruction must focus on meaningful communication for a real purpose.
So no more writing into the void.
Exactly. You cannot just assign a topic like write about your summer vacation and walk away.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Teaching writing in total isolation like that feels to me like trying to teach someone to swim on dry land.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to put it.
Right, like you can explain the strokes all day, but you have to integrate it with the water. You have to integrate writing with the reading and the speaking.
And that integration of skills is the cornerstone of the modern classroom. You design a cohesive sequence.
Walk us through what that looks like.
Sure. For example, you have the students read an article about climate change first. Then they listen to a podcast debating the issue. Next, you organize an oral debate right there in the classroom.
Okay, so they are immersed in the topic.
Fully immersed. And only then do you ask them to write an argumentative essay defending their position.
Wow. Because by the time they get to the blank page, they aren't staring at it in a panic anymore.
Exactly.
They already have the vocabulary, they've heard the counter-arguments, they've literally tested their ideas out loud.
And think about the implications of that for inclusive practices, which your exam will definitely want you to cover.
Oh, absolutely. The examiner wants to see that you can handle diverse classrooms.
Right. A classroom has diverse learners with totally different cognitive strengths and anxiety levels. A student who has intense anxiety about writing what we call a high effective filter might actually be incredibly confident during the oral debate.
Right.
That speaking activity builds their confidence and gives them the raw material they need so that when they finally sit down to draft, the cognitive load is significantly reduced.
That's incredibly powerful. And because we know the process is recursive, like Flower and Hayes said, the teacher is providing process-oriented support throughout that entire sequence.
Yes, constant support.
That means constant formative feedback. And importantly, peer collaboration, right? Letting students review each other's messy first drafts. I imagine that alone does wonders for a student's confidence. Just seeing that the smartest kid in the class also writes terrible first drafts.
It demystifies the entire endeavor. It proves to the student that writing isn't some magical talent you're simply born with. It's a mechanical process of drafting and revising that anyone can learn.
So let's bring this down to the ground level. We have the Delheim's theory, we have the Flower and Hayes recursive models, we have the integrated pedagogy.
A whole foundation.
Right. On a practical level, what kinds of activities are actually happening in this classroom, and how do we evaluate them without crushing the student's spirit?
Okay, so the sources categorize the main task types you should deploy in your classroom. And you should list these in your essay.
Okay, what's first?
First is narrative writing. This is usually where learners start, recounting personal experiences or telling stories. It relies heavily on sequencing events in the past.
Okay, narrative.
Second is descriptive writing. This is where they detail people, places, or objects. And this really challenges their lexical competence and their use of spatial connectors.
And then third is argumentative writing, which I imagine carries the highest cognitive load of all.
It absolutely does, which is why argumentative tasks are usually reserved for higher CEFR levels.
Makes sense.
Argumentative writing isn't just about sharing an opinion. A foreign language learner has to manage the target language while simultaneously anticipating counter-arguments. They're using complex hedging language like although or nevertheless and structuring a logical defense.
That is a lot to juggle. And we also have to account for the digital reality in these activities, right?
Oh, for sure.
Because to hit that CEFR requirement for written interaction, the classroom has to feature modern formats like collaborative writing on shared documents, maintaining classroom blogs, participating in moderated online forums.
Because we are preparing them for the digital communication they will actually use in their careers.
But inevitably, grading day arrives.
Cue the ominous music.
All right. So what does this all mean for the teacher on grading day? Assessing written communication seems like the exact place where many teachers fall back into those bad habits.
It is. But you have to evaluate both the form and the content to get a comprehensive view of the learner's abilities.
Wait, I have to push back on this.
Okay, hit me.
We have spent this entire deep dive establishing that writing is about communicative competence. Del Himes told us that communication and ideas matter most.
Yes, he did.
So, if a student writes a brilliant, persuasive argument, but they mess up a bunch of verb conjugations, why are we still grading grammatical accuracy? Isn't that just reverting to the old, outdated, red pen mindset we are supposed to be escaping?
That is the ultimate tension in language teaching.
Truly.
And it is exactly why your sources emphasize the use of analytical rubrics.
Analytical rubrics. Okay, explain that.
If you read that brilliant but grammatically flawed essay and just slap a holistic grade on it, say, a C- the student feels punished for taking a risk with their ideas.
I feel deflated.
An analytical rubric prevents that by breaking the assessment down into distinct, separate criteria.
Ah, so you divorce the grammar from the ideas.
Exactly. You assess grammatical accuracy, yes, because that studio album structure still ultimately matters for clarity. But you separately assess vocabulary range. You separately assess discourse, coherence, do they use connector as well, and you separately assess the logical development of their ideas.
Oh, I see. So the student looks at the rubric and sees, okay, I got a low score on grammatical accuracy, but my teacher gave me a phenomenal score on idea development and coherence.
Yes. It becomes a diagnostic map rather than a punishment.
That is so smart.
It allows the teacher to really balance the scales. You reward the brilliant communicative risks while still gently targeting the structural components for their next recursive loop. It bridges the gap between the high-minded theory of Del Himes and the practical reality of evaluating a secondary school student.
Well, if we zoom out and look at the blueprint of what your exam answer needs to look like, this narrative journey, we've just taken maps perfectly onto the ultra-short memory version in your sources.
It really does. It's 9 clear steps.
So let's recap those rapidly. When you sit down in that exam hall, step 1, you start by redefining writing. You bring in the CEFR. And you drop Del Himes' communicative competence to show writing is about purpose, not just grammar.
Step 2. You explore the unique nature of the text itself, the permanence, the luxury of planning, the need for structure.
Step 3. You break down the 4 components a writer must master: grammatical, lexical, discourse, and cognitive skills.
Step 4. You transition into the mind of the writer. You introduce Flower and Hayes to prove that writing is a messy, recursive process of planning, drafting, and revising, not a linear assembly line.
Step 5. You tie that back to the CEFR's demand for interactive written communication.
Step 6, which logically forces you into pedagogy. Because writing is recursive and interactive, you explain that teaching it requires an integrated approach.
Step 7. You connect writing to reading and speaking, fostering inclusive practices that lower student anxiety.
Step 8. You land on the practical application. You outline narrative, descriptive, and argumentative tasks alongside modern digital interaction.
And finally, step 9. You close your essay by explaining how analytical rubrics allow a teacher to assess both accuracy and brilliant ideas without destroying a student's motivation.
And you wrap up with a strong conclusion, stating that fostering written communication isn't just about passing a language test. It is about developing critical thinking and giving students the tools to participate academically and socially in a globalized world.
If you follow that logical through line, you are demonstrating a master-level understanding of the topic. You are showing the examiner that you don't just know the buzzwords, but you know how they live and breathe in a real classroom.
Absolutely.
We are wishing you the absolute best of luck on your teaching exam. You have the blueprint. Now you just have to trust your own recursive process when you sit down to write it.
But, as you prepare to step into the classroom of the future, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over.
Oh, what's that?
Well, we define the nature of written communication today largely by its permanence and the luxury of time to plan. But as you teach a generation of students who are immersed in instantaneous digital messaging, autocomplete, and predictive text algorithms that literally finish their sentences for them, you really have to wonder, how will the sheer speed and automation fundamentally change our very definition of communicative competence for the next era of language learners?
Wow, now that is something to think about.